Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're in our second episode in our exciting and highly eye-opening series, Mature Buck Mindsets, looking at the mind of big bucks and big buck hunters and just how they are exceptionally different than most. And again, the season theme is how to consistently take the top deer where you hunt. In this episode, I'm with a very well-known student of whitetail and whitetail hunters, Richard P. Smith, who's been an outdoor writer his whole life, focusing and studying whitetail. He has interviewed thousands of big buck killers and found some common themes we can learn from and put into practice to do the same. And you can download our free journal to use with this podcast. That's really going to help. So here are the top things to look for during this episode. What does Richard mean by walking with whitetails, and how does this contribute to his knowledge base? What key characteristics has Richard noticed that big buck killers all have in common? What percent of those hunters are lucky versus good, and what can we take from that? What do most hunters do wrong when targeting big old bucks? And according to us both, what can't even our modern technology give us advantage on when it comes to deer hunting? And what are Richard's top 2 things he suggests you do to be more consistent and get chances at the biggest bucks right where you hunt? And there's a ton more good stuff in there as usual, so let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. Okay, I'm with Richard P. Smith. Richard, welcome to the Deer IQ podcast.
Glad to be with you, Adam.
Yeah, glad to have you on. And today we're going to be talking about do a couple segments. The first segment is going to be on mature buck mindsets. And if you don't know Richard, he's a prolific writer. He's been writing articles for major magazines for a lot of years. Maybe you've read some of them. Also, he's written a ton of books, I'm just starting to write my first book, and that's quite a process. So hats off to Richard just for doing more than one of those.
I'm up to 32 now, Adam.
Yeah, that's crazy. So before we jump into talking about mature bucks and all that, tell us a little bit more about you and your background, just in case people don't know you.
Well, I've been at this as an outdoor writer and photographer since I was in high school. I started writing for the local newspaper in Marquette, the Mining Journal, when I was in high school. The editor of the newspaper at the time, Ken Lowe, put together a weekly outdoor page for the newspaper. I read it, was interested in it, and I was hunting and fishing and experiencing things as interesting as were covered on the outdoor page. So I talked to Ken about contributing to the outdoor page, and he was very helpful and accepted some of the stuff that I contributed. I ended up writing a weekly column eventually for the newspaper and contributing features. It branched out into magazines. Interestingly, Ken Lowe eventually became editor of Michigan Out of Doors magazine, published by Michigan United Conservation Clubs. I started working with Ken, contributing to that magazine, as well as other magazines, and eventually started writing books as well. My first book was published in 1978, and at the time, I swore I'd never write another one, but it was very successful. There was Outdoor Life had a book club at the time. The book was deer hunting, and the book was picked up by the book club, did well, so that was incentive to write other books. Yeah, and as an outdoor writer, I get to set my own schedule. I hunt deer year-round with a camera. I'm out there almost every day of the year looking for deer, photographing deer, learning about them. And there's a local park where there's no hunting. Deer have gotten used to me. I spend so much time around them. I can walk with them. Very few people are able to do that. And in most cases, wild deer won't let you do that are hunted. But these deer aren't hunted. They've gotten used to me. I can walk with them. I've seen deer behavior and learn more about whitetails by walking with them than would be possible any other way.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because and I've talked about this before in the podcast. If hunters are honest, we don't spend a lot of time observing whitetail, right? Even if you are a hardcore hunter and you spend a ton of days in a tree stand or blind or whatever in the field, a small percentage of that is actually observing deer, right?
Yeah.
And so
Right.
people that have done what you've done or in written a bunch of books where you talk to other people, right? So that's magnifying your, I guess, deer knowledge on actual deer, right? Observing the deer. Or if you're a deer farmer where you're like living with them, like that is way more knowledge based than a standard hunter, right? That goes out
As
and
far as deer behavior, right?
yeah, because I might observe 5 minutes of deer behavior in a good hunt, right? So that really adds up, and that's really important. And so, and hats off to you for all the writing. I personally know that's difficult. It's difficult to get in to make a living doing that. So, hats off to you on that. Let's talk about mature bucks, and from your years' experience and the books you've written, you've interviewed a bunch of guys too. Not only are you a hunter, but you've interviewed a bunch of guys that have taken these really big bucks, right? And you have books about that people can read.
Right.
From your experience and from that, what have you noticed about guys that take big bucks? Like, what are some key characteristics or things that you've observed about them?
Well, most of them are experienced hunters who've been hunting whitetails for years, and they're in situations where they have lots of time to scout and to hunt deer. The scouting is a real important part of the picture. Um, a lot of hunters don't spend enough time scouting. By learning as much as you can about deer movements, uh, deer travels, while scouting, looking at sign and trail cameras today have revolutionized the ability of hunters to scout, to learn where the biggest deer in the area that they hunt are and where they travel. And so scouting is important, although you can divide successful big buck hunters into two categories. There's the successful hunters who do it consistently. Those are very rare. There aren't a lot of hunters in that category. But there's another category of hunters who kill Boone and Crockett bucks uh, because they've captured photos of them and are lucky enough to connect on them. Some hunters who take the biggest bucks in Michigan every year didn't know the buck was even there. Luck is a major factor in the killing of about half to three quarters of the big bucks that are killed every year. Luck is a major factor.
Yeah, I think that's a real key point. And you kind of have the lucky hunters, and then you have the smart hunters that are putting stuff together to get it done
Exactly.
more consistently. And if you look at the odds, I would much rather be a hunter that understands why I'm doing stuff and putting the odds in my favor versus just, I'm going to go out and sit in the woods and hopefully I'll get lucky. And that's some people's attitudes. And I would encourage people toward the putting odds in your favor and using scouting, right? Like that's
Right.
your data collection. That's how you know the when and the where and all that stuff. Not relying on luck, right? We can all
Yeah.
go out and buy lottery tickets, but that's not a good investment, right? So, so you said what percentage of hunters do you think, based on your interviews, and this is ballpark, are lucky hunters versus know what they're doing and can do it consistently?
Probably 75% versus 25,
Yeah.
roughly in that neighborhood. It might be lower than 25% actually. There's not a lot of hunters who are consistently successful on older age and big bucks. Now, I've interviewed hunters for years that take the biggest bucks in Michigan. Learning from them how they've been successful has made me more successful in using some of that information. Um, in another mindset besides those already mentioned is being persistent, being a multi-season hunter. hunting bow and arrow, early season, hunting regular firearms, hunting muzzleloader, hunting late archery. I interviewed one hunter who took a 200 class non-typical. He hunted that deer for 78 days through all of the different seasons and finally killed that buck with a crossbow during the late archery season. I forget what county it was, but it was in the southern part of the state. Being persistent and hunting during multiple seasons increases your chances of taking that big buck, big time, versus someone who just bow hunts or someone who just gun hunts. Being versatile and flexible in being as persistent as possible in trying to connect. And along with that, as you well know, Adam, if you want to kill big bucks, it's important to pass up the small ones.
Yeah.
Not many beginning hunters can do that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a basic one a lot of people don't get. I want to circle back to one thing real quick and then talk about a couple of things you just mentioned. But first of all, you mentioned scouting, right? Like these hunters and the percentage of time spent scouting versus hunting with these hunters that are not the lucky hunters, but the consistent hunters, right?
Right.
Because that's what we can do something about, right? I can't do much about my luck, but I can do something about the consistency part, and those guys scout. What would you say as far as the percentage of time these guys spend scouting versus hunting is? Could you throw a number on that?
Well, it's far more time scouting than they actually hunting. The best hunters know when and where they're going to kill a buck before the season opens. Tony LaPrade is a perfect example. He's taken bucks that qualify for state records more than 30 years in a row on 52 acres of land he owns. And normally he only hunts a handful of days for the entire season to kill 2 bucks. He hunts a day or two for each one because he knows from scouting, trail cameras, and how he has his property set up where it increases his opportunity to kill a buck quickly.
Yeah, and a lot of the guys that I've noticed, and I can attest to this myself in my own hunting. You know, when I first started hunting, I hunted hard, right? I hunted a lot, and I didn't have a lot of success, right? But as you start figuring things out, and you look at these guys that do consistently do it, like Tony is an example, and I've talked to him multiple times, is like they don't hunt that much.
Right.
They really don't. They have it figured out. They spend a ton of time scouting or knowing their property. Like Tony hunts on private now. He has his own spot, his own land, and he has it figured out, right? He's engineered it. He's done this and that, but he knows pretty much what the bucks are going to do, when they're going to do it. That's the only time he hunts, right? Like it's a very efficient, I call surgical strike, right?
Yeah.
Not just, I'm going to get out and hunt because it's the first day of season or whatever. I'm just going to get out there. It's much more measured than that, right? So let's contrast that to, you mentioned the idea of persistence. You know, this guy that hunted 78 days to kill that one in Michigan. And I'm from Michigan, you're from Michigan, just to put this in perspective. Pretty high pressure state. So how do those two things jive, right? Being very, putting more scouting in, but then being persistent. If I'm hunting hard, I've found that I pressure deer too much, right? So what's the balance there? Or can you, I guess, clarify that a little bit?
Well, this guy that hunted 78 days, he knew.
Okay, so here is your high IQ moment. So we all know luck is part of the equation sometimes, but how much luck do you rely on versus making calculated moves and decisions? It's an honest question to ask that, if answered, can really open up the door to being a more consistent hunter. If you look at hunting as luck, I would challenge you to change your paradigm a little bit and try to look at it this way. Since we can't control all factors in life and in hunting, take that off the table and solely focus on things you can do, control, and change to tilt the scales in your favor. Decrease the amount of luck you rely on as much as possible, and from my experience, this will produce much more luck for you in the field. It's not really about things outside of your control, but focusing on the top things you can do that give the biggest results. Something to think about if you want to consistently take the top deer and mature bucks where you hunt. And if you want to become a more deadly and consistent hunter on mature whitetail, the biggest thing you can do to help you get there is actually know where you need to focus and work to help you. The Deer IQ test is the only thing out there that will tell you exactly that and take years off your learning curve. It objectively lets you know your strengths and weaknesses in the 6 core competencies of highly effective hunters. So you can stop guessing and get right to what makes the biggest difference for you as a hunter. Take that and get the free consultation below, and also check out the other great Deer IQ services, including land plans and our advanced whitetail workshop, now taking registrations. All right, and now let's get back to the podcast. Hunting hard, I've found that I pressure deer too much, right? So what's the balance there, or can you, I guess, clarify that a little bit?
Well, this guy that hunted 78 days, he knew the area this big buck was hanging around in. He had permission to hunt the property. I'm not sure that he owned the property. In many cases, older bucks will go nocturnal or leave an area when they're too heavily pressured. In this instance, the buck maintained his home territory, allowing this guy to continue hunting it. And he saw it periodically, knowing it was still there. In fact, he did get a shot at it during gun season, but missed. That's why he had to keep hunting to try and get it. It's a matter of combining the two, having the knowledge of where deer are moving and when to hunt them, and having scent control, reduce the chances deer are going to wind you or know you're there, and hunting the best days, as many days as it's necessary to connect. We're not all as good as Tony, where we can 1 or 2 days we can get the buck we're after.
Yeah, I think that's key, because as you're hunting, you're collecting more data, right? So if this buck you're talking about is showing you he's still active in the area, then that means, well, you're not totally pressuring him out of there, right? And he's giving you these opportunities that would indicate to you, I can keep hunting him. And I'm guessing the guy did it in such a way that it was low impact, right? So he had multiple opportunities at this deer. And, I mean, you and I have probably never missed a deer, right?
That's not true.
But joking there, but yeah, it's a reading it, right? Like, you typically don't get a bunch of chances at a big buck, a mature buck, but if you read it and play it right, it sounds like that's what that guy did. So it's this dance of sorts, this art, I might call it, of hunting a spot and hunting a deer where you're letting them kind of tell you what you can and can't do, type thing.
Yeah.
So what are some of the mistakes? Let's get into that, because again, you have all this data from these hunters that shot big bucks. What are some of the, I guess, big mistakes you've observed people making going after some big bucks through the years?
Overhunting stands and or hunting stands too early. Like you, I do a lot of hunting. I hunt as many days during hunting season with bow and gun as I can, but I've learned that it's important to wait until you've got daytime activity among older age bucks, which is usually late October into November, pre-rut and rut phase. It increases your chances of getting a shot at older bucks during legal shooting time. If you put a lot of pressure on a stand where a big buck is prior to them moving during daylight hours, they're going to catch on to your activities. Whitetails pattern us better than we pattern them in many cases. And a lot of hunters don't understand that. A buck that goes through an area at night, smells your scent by your stand, some of them will just avoid that area in the future.
Yep.
So by waiting until late October, early November, when you're starting to get trail camera photos of adult bucks during hours of daylight, that's when you can increase your chance of success. If you hunt that stand heavily early on, it reduces your chances of scoring.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough, right? And I think the problem is we've all been there. We're humans. We probably think and act very similar. Is that I think I can get away with stuff, right?
Yeah.
That other people can't because I'm a better hunter or something, and you just can't. And it's interesting to think with all our technology and our cellular trail cameras and stuff like that, that they still are way better at detecting us and figuring us out than us them, right?
That's correct.
The advantage is still strongly in favor of the deer. So in order to keep it so they don't know they're being hunted, like just don't be there, right? Like that's the simplest way to do it and go in at the right time. And you mentioned on a particular stand, right? Maybe hunting a stand too early. I think I know what you mean by that, but what do you mean by that in particular? Like,
well, our bow deer season opens October 1st, and there are some big bucks killed that first week of October. Some bucks are still on their early season feeding pattern, and if you've got bucks in those type of situation where you've got daylight photos of them during early October, go for it, but in many cases, from my experience, I'm not getting many daylight photos of bucks during that first week of October. Although last year I had a bunch of photos of adult bucks at one of my stands in the Upper Peninsula. We can still hunt over bait, and I generally do that. I don't always do that, but I had a bunch of photos of adult bucks visiting a bait in late September leading up to October. I thought, all right, here's my chance. October 1st, nothing. They changed.
it was on the
Were
calendar.
more nocturnal once bow season opened.
Yeah, they had it on the calendar there. Yeah, that's a big point, and I think for a particular stand, you need to know when that is good for, right? Like if you historically know, maybe if it's a new stand spot, you've got to figure that out and do your best guess. But over time, if you have similar stand sites that you hunt, when is this best good for, and not burning it out before that time, right? So,
yeah.
For example, on public land, I see this a lot, and it drives me nuts, to be honest with you, because guys will first day of season, because this is what I think, because they hear it on podcasts, because they've been listening to this or that person, they think they need to go into the deepest swamp the first hunt, and you don't. Especially here in mid-Michigan, you got a lot of ag stuff. You can hunt more edges initially before the deer know they're being hunted, and then progressively you go a little deeper. But these guys will go back to these really deep bedding stand locations the first day, and they're just super intrusive. And I would say that's more of a rut spot later in the season versus the first day of season, right? So it's understanding a particular stand when you should or should not hunt that, right? And having multiple stands that I can hunt, right? I have stands that are spots that are good early season for particular reasons, and then maybe lull spots, and then maybe pre-rut and rut spots, right? And then late season spots, and you got to kind of figure that stuff out, or you're going to shoot yourself in the foot big time. And the bad thing about public land hunting is you're shooting other people in the foot too. That's a whole nother issue, but really knowing that stuff is really important.
Yeah. And the point you made about having multiple stands is real important. If you've only got one stand site, you're going to overhunt it.
Yeah.
Or unless you hold off and delay hunting until the odds are best of scoring on that stand.
Yep.
The best thing is to have multiple stand sites taking into account different wind directions, different feeding locations, different travel routes. So you can rotate around, reduces the chances you're going to burn out any one stand.
Yeah, true. Very true. I've got a question for you that's not on our list here, but I think it's an interesting one you might be able to shed light on from interviewing all these guys that have shot big bucks, right? One thing I've noticed, and I think this is a human psychology thing, I've noticed it in me. It doesn't even have to apply to deer hunting, but it obviously does. That if I'm a hunter and I have success early on, maybe I'm a young hunter, or maybe I'm just, I've never shot a real big buck, and then all of a sudden I do shoot a big buck. I think psychologically that changes the game. And if I don't understand why, my ego starts playing into this, right? Like if I don't know why I shot this big buck at this location and this time, it's hard for me to replicate that. Like if I don't understand the why. But once you do shoot a big buck, it's like your ego takes over and you think you know, and somehow that makes you it makes it hard for you to learn and repeat that. Have you noticed anything like that? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do, and that's true in some cases, but not always. A lot of people who kill big bucks, their first big buck, recognize they were just lucky.
Yeah.
And what they did had not a lot to do with them connecting on that big deer. But there are some, as you said, who thinks once they kill one, put their tag on that big buck, that they know it'd be easy to do it again. Some of those people underestimate whitetails in the individuality of these older bucks. These older age bucks have lived as long as they have because they're good at avoiding hunters, outsmarting hunters. And some of them have been missed and they lucked out in not being killed. But in most cases, those deer have learned how to avoid hunters. And you have to take that into account for each individual big buck.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. It just making sure you stay open to learning and knowing that you don't ever have it all figured out, and trying to figure out the why. Like, why did this happen, if it's good or bad, and learn from that and keep applying that as a hunter so you don't keep making mistakes and so you can replicate, right? If I shot some big buck, these are the conditions, I'm going to try to replicate that, and I've got to learn from that first one, right? Well, as we kind of wrap up here, Richard, maybe we end here. So if you could talk to a person that's, hey, I want to shoot a big buck or shoot another big buck, I did it one time or whatever, what are like the top couple things from your experience and all this knowledge you would say, hey, focus on these two things? And we might have already talked about it, but what would those two things be?
Well, learn as much as you can through scouting about the deer's movements and habits. Trail cameras are an ideal tool to gain as much knowledge about when and where deer are moving. I mean, you can't put a trail camera everywhere, but putting them strategically to get an idea where you think that deer is coming from, where you think it's going, to gather as much data as possible. And when there's snow on the ground, as there often is in the Upper Peninsula, that's a perfect time to either backtrack bucks or track them forward to find out where they've been and where they're going. You can learn a tremendous amount about deer habits and potential stand sites by snow tracking deer during the season or after the season. That's part of scouting. After the season is over, you can learn a lot about deer movements and potential stand sites by following buck tracks.
Yeah, those are good points, and that leads very well into our next segment where we're going to talk about tracking and different things there. So, well, Richard, it was great talking. Thanks for being on this segment of the podcast. All right, here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. Do you walk with whitetails like Richard does almost every day of the year? That's a big one to try, but what can you do to be a whitetail walker and increase your time in the whitetail buck's ultimate classroom, his domain? What things can you do? And next time I'm going to share a personal story of one of the bucks here on my wall, my Ohio 16 point from 2020, looking at this mature buck's mindset and mine and the details of how all that worked out. You won't want to miss that great episode as we continue with the series Mature Buck Mindsets. And I'll see you then.